The wind cut through the valley like a blade, and 8-year-old Mercy pulled her thin shawl tighter as she hurried toward her cabin. But something dark in the snow made her stop. It was a man, collapsed and barely breathing, his weathered face blue from the cold. Most folks in town crossed the street when they saw his kind. Most folks had warned her to stay away from the native people who sometimes passed through. But Mercy had been cold and hungry enough times to recognize death creeping in, and she couldn't walk away. She dragged him inside her tiny cabin, surprised by how light he felt. His breathing was shallow, his lips nearly white. She wrapped every blanket she owned around him and built up the fire until her small room glowed warm and bright. When his eyes opened hours later, they were sharp and clear, studying her face with an intensity that made her step back. "You are brave, little one," he said, his voice rough but kind. "Braver than most grown men in your town." Something in his tone made her nervous. Not afraid exactly, but aware that this moment mattered in a way she couldn't understand. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked. He nodded slowly, still watching her. "My people will look for me when the storm passes. They will want to know who helped me." He paused, and she saw something complicated cross his face. "That could be dangerous for you." Mercy felt her chest tighten. She had saved him because it was right, not because it was safe, but now, sitting in her warm cabin with this stranger who looked at her like she had done something extraordinary, she wondered if kindness always came with a price. Outside, the storm raged on, and inside, two people from different worlds waited to see what the morning would bring. Dawn came gray and silent, the storm finally exhausted. Mercy woke to find the old man sitting by her fireplace, stronger now, carefully feeding small branches to the flames. She had expected him to be gone, to have slipped away like smoke in the night. "You should eat," he said without turning around. "Growing children need more food than you've been getting." She looked down at her thin arms, her dress that hung loose where it should fit snug. Nobody in town paid much attention to the orphan girl, who lived in the smallest cabin on the edge of everything. She scraped for work, traded sewing for bread, made soup from bones the butcher threw away. "I do fine," she said, but her stomach growled loudly enough to contradict her. He turned then, and she saw his face clearly for the first time, weathered, but dignified, with silver threading through his dark hair. His clothes were well made but travel-worn, and there was something about the way he carried himself that spoke of authority, of respect earned rather than demanded. "My name is Joseph," he said. "I lead my people through the mountain passes each season. We trade with settlements, sometimes help travelers who lose their way." He paused. "Yesterday I was the one who was lost." Mercy nodded, unsure what to say. She had heard stories about the native tribes, most of them warnings about savages and raids. But Joseph spoke like the school teacher who had tried to teach her letters before the town decided education was wasted on orphans. "The people in town," Joseph continued carefully, "they would not have helped me." It wasn't a question, and Mercy couldn't deny it. She had seen how they looked when native people passed through with fear, suspicion, sometimes hatred. "They think you might hurt them," she said honestly. Joseph smiled, "But it was sad around the edges, and yet you pulled me from the snow." "You were dying," she said simply. That seemed more important than what other people might think. Something shifted in his expression then, a kind of recognition that made Mercy feel exposed, like he was seeing something in her that she didn't know was there. He stood and walked to the small window, looking out at the white-blanketed valley. "My people will come today," he said quietly. "When they find me here with you." He turned back to her, and she saw worry in his eyes. "Some of them have lost much to your kind. Their trust is not easily given." Mercy felt her heart speed up. "Will they hurt me?" Joseph was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think you may surprise them, just as you surprised me." In the distance, barely visible through the snow-laden pines, dark figures appeared on horseback, moving steadily toward her cabin. The riders approached slowly, their horses picking careful paths through the deep snow. Mercy counted 5 of them, all wrapped in heavy fur and leather, their faces hard to read in the gray morning light. Joseph stood straighter, his posture changing, from that of a tired traveler to something more commanding. "Stay behind me," he told Mercy, but not unkindly. "Let me speak first." Through the window, Mercy watched the lead rider dismount. He was younger than Joseph, with broad shoulders and eyes that swept across her small cabin like he was looking for threats. When his gaze found her face in the window, it lingered with an intensity that made her step back. Joseph opened the door before they could knock. The young man stepped forward, relief and concern warring on his features. "Father," he said, and Mercy realized this must be Joseph's son. "When you didn't return, we feared the worst." "The storm came faster than expected," Joseph replied calmly. "I would have frozen without help." The son's eyes flicked to Mercy, who had moved to stand just behind Joseph despite her fear. She saw surprise cross his face. She was smaller than most children her age, her clothes patched and mended, her hair braided with strips of cloth instead of proper ribbons. "This child helped you?" another rider asked, dismounting to get a better look. His voice carried disbelief, perhaps even suspicion. "This child saved my life," Joseph corrected firmly. "She found me in the snow, brought me to warmth, shared her food and shelter." He placed a gentle hand on Mercy's shoulder. She risked much to help a stranger. The riders exchanged glances that Mercy couldn't interpret. Their language was different, their customs unfamiliar, but she recognized the weight of their stares. They were judging her, measuring something she didn't understand. Joseph's son stepped closer, studying Mercy's face with the same intensity his father had shown. "You live here alone?" he asked. Mercy nodded. "My parents died 2 winters ago. The town lets me stay because no one else wants this place." It was the truth, stark and simple. "And the town's people," the suspicious rider pressed. "They know you helped him." "Not yet," Mercy admitted. The storm kept everyone inside. The men spoke rapidly in their own language, voices low but urgent. Mercy caught the tone of disagreement, perhaps even argument. Joseph responded with authority, but she could sense tension building between them. Finally, Joseph's son turned back to her. "What's your name?" "Mercy," she said, lifting her chin despite her fear. "Mercy Whitmore." The effect of her last name was immediate and startling. The riders went completely still, staring at her with expressions that had shifted from suspicion to something else entirely. Joseph's son took a step back, his face pale. "Whitmore," he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the word. Mercy looked between them, confused and suddenly frightened. "What's wrong? What did I say?" Joseph placed his hand on his son's arm, a silent warning to be careful with his words, but the damage was already done. The riders continued staring at Mercy like she was a ghost made flesh, and she felt smaller and more vulnerable with each passing second. "There is no harm in the child," Joseph said firmly, speaking to his men, but watching his son's face. "She knows nothing of old grievances, but she carries the name," the suspicious rider insisted, his voice tight with old anger. "How can we ignore what her family did to us?" Mercy's chest felt tight with confusion and fear. "I don't understand. What did my family do? I don't even remember them clearly." Joseph's son knelt down so he was at her eye level, his expression softer now, but still intense. "What do you know about your parents, Mercy? What did the townspeople tell you about how they died?" "The fever took them both in 1 week," she said, the words coming out smaller than she intended. "People said it was God's will that some families are just unlucky." The riders exchanged meaningful looks again. Joseph's son shook his head slowly. They didn't tell you the truth. Thomas, Joseph warned. But his son continued. Your father was a military man, Mercy, a captain who led raids against our people 15 years ago. Many of our families lost fathers, brothers, sons because of his orders. Thomas's voice was careful, not cruel, but each word hit Mercy like a physical blow. She staggered backward, shaking her head. No, that's not true. My father wouldn't have hurt anyone. He was following orders, Joseph said gently. Soldiers often do terrible things they wish they could undo, but the hurt he caused was real. Mercy felt the world tilting around her. Everything she thought she knew about herself, about her place in the world, was crumbling. Then why did you help me? She asked Thomas, her voice barely a whisper. Why didn't you just leave him to die? Thomas looked at his father, then back at her. Because you didn't know. Because you're just a child who saw someone dying and chose kindness over fear. One of the other riders stepped forward, older than Thomas, his face marked by a long scar across his cheek. The girl may be innocent, but the debt remains. Her father killed my brother in cold blood during a peace meeting. Killed him under a flag of truce. The words hung in the cold air like smoke. Mercy felt tears burning her eyes. Not just from sadness, but from shame she didn't understand. How could she be responsible for things that happened before she could even walk? What are you going to do to me? She asked, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. The scarred man looked at Joseph, waiting for an answer that might change everything. In the distance, Mercy could see smoke rising from chimneys in town, where people were waking up to a world that didn't know their orphan girl had just discovered she was the daughter of their enemy. But before anyone could answer, hoofbeats thundered across the snow. More riders were coming fast from the direction of town, and they weren't native. 3 men from town rode hard through the snow, their horses breathing steam in the cold air. Mercy recognized them immediately. Miller, the blacksmith who never paid her fairly for mending. Crawford, who owned the general store and always watched her like she might steal something, and Sheriff Baines, whose hand rested on his gun, even now. We saw the smoke from your chimney, girl, Sheriff Baines called out as they approached, his eyes fixed on the native men surrounding Mercy's cabin. Figured we'd better check if you were in trouble, but Mercy could see it wasn't concern for her that brought them. It was the sight of 5 native men on horses too close to town for comfort. The kind of situation that made frightened people do dangerous things. I'm fine, Sheriff, Mercy said quickly, stepping forward. These men were just... We can see what they were doing, Crawford interrupted, his voice tight with suspicion. The question is why you've got them here instead of running for help, like any sensible girl would do. Joseph moved slightly, placing himself between Mercy and the townsman. The gesture was protective, but also provocative. It made the sheriff's hand shift closer to his weapon. The child helped my father when he was lost in the storm, Thomas said, his voice carefully neutral. We came to thank her and make sure she was safe. Safe? Miller laughed harshly. From what? You people are the ones who make things unsafe around here. Mercy felt the tension crackling between the two groups like lightning before a storm. These men from town had never cared about her safety before. She had been hungry, cold, and alone for 2 years, without anyone checking on her welfare. But now, with native men nearby, suddenly they were concerned citizens. Sheriff, she said, trying to keep her voice steady, they haven't hurt me. Joseph was hurt and I helped him. That's all. Sheriff Baines studied her face, looking for signs of coercion or fear. What he saw seemed to confuse him. Mercy was frightened, but not of Joseph or his men. She was frightened of what the townspeople might do. Girl doesn't know any better, Crawford said dismissively. Probably doesn't understand the danger she's been in. The scarred native rider took a step forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. The only danger here is from men who ride armed to a child's home and speak of Her like she cannot think for herself. Watch your tongue, Sheriff Baines warned, his gun clearing its holster halfway before Joseph raised his hand. There is no need for weapons, Joseph said calmly, but Mercy could hear the steel underneath his words. We are grateful for the child's kindness. We will leave peacefully. Maybe you will, Sheriff Baines said, not lowering his gun. But first, I want to know what you people were really doing up in these mountains. Scouting for raids, looking for weak spots in our defenses. Thomas's jaw tightened. We were trading with settlements to the north. My father got caught in the storm on the way back. So you say? The sheriff's eyes narrowed. But we've heard reports of missing livestock, strange tracks around farmsteads. Seems mighty convenient that you just happened to end up here. Mercy's stomach dropped. She could see where this was heading. Accusations, anger, violence that would solve nothing and hurt everyone. She was caught between two groups of men who saw each other as enemies, and she was about to become the reason they started fighting. But as the tension reached its breaking point, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Joseph was looking past the sheriff toward town, his expression suddenly alert and worried. More riders were coming. A lot more. A dozen riders thundered across the snow-covered valley, and Mercy's heart sank when she recognized them. These weren't more townspeople coming to help. They were the kind of men who came when they smelled trouble and wanted to make it worse. Rough men from the outlying farms, men who had lost livestock to wolves and blamed every hardship on raiders and thieves. This doesn't look good, Sheriff Baines muttered, but he didn't holster his weapon. Instead, he seemed to be calculating odds, deciding which side of the coming fight would serve him better. Joseph stepped closer to Mercy, his presence both protective and dangerous. She could feel the situation spinning beyond anyone's control like a wagon wheel that had lost its pin and was racing downhill toward disaster. You should leave, she whispered to Thomas, her voice urgent. Take your father and go. These men won't listen to reason. But Thomas shook his head, his eyes on the approaching riders. We don't abandon our own, and we don't run from men who live on fear. The lead rider pulled up hard. Snow sprayed from his horse's hooves. Mercy recognized him as Garrett Hayes, a man whose farm bordered the mountains and who blamed every missing chicken on native raids. His face was flushed with cold and excitement, and his hand already rested on his rifle. Well, well, Hayes said, looking around at the scene. Looks like our little orphan girl has been entertaining some interesting guests. Garrett, this isn't what you think, Sheriff Baines said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was outnumbered now, and Mercy could see him choosing sides. Isn't it? Hayes swung down from his saddle, his boots crunching in the snow. Looks to me like we've got a nest of raiders right here in our backyard. And this girl's been helping them. I saved a man who was dying, Mercy said, stepping forward. Despite her fear, that's all I did. Hayes laughed, but there was no humor in it. Saved him for what? So he could report back about our defenses. So he could tell his people which farms are easy targets. You're wrong, Mercy insisted, but her voice sounded small against the growing crowd of hostile faces. Am I? Hayes turned to address the other men who had ridden with him. Boys, I think it's time we had a serious conversation about whose side our little orphan is really on. The scarred native rider took a step forward, his hand moving toward his weapon. The child has done nothing wrong. Your quarrel is not with her. My quarrel, Hayes said, his voice rising, is with anyone who helps enemies of decent folk, and it looks to me like that includes her. Mercy felt the world closing in around her. These men had never cared about her before, but now they were ready to call her a traitor for showing basic human kindness. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, townspeople she had known all her life. Native men she had just met, all of them angry and afraid and ready for violence. But then Joseph did something unexpected. He walked calmly to his horse and removed something from his saddlebags. When he turned back, he was holding a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. Perhaps, he said quietly. We can settle this like civilized men. Hayes's eyes fixed on the pouch with undisguised greed, but before he could respond, Thomas grabbed his father's arm. No, Thomas said firmly, not this time, not for her. And that's when Mercy realized that something fundamental had changed. In how these men saw her. Something that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with honor. Joseph looked at his son for a long moment, then slowly put the pouch back in his saddlebags. When he turned to face Hayes and the other townsmen, his posture had changed completely. He no longer looked like a grateful traveler offering payment. He looked like a chief making a declaration. You are right, Thomas, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. This child's debt cannot be paid with coins. Hayes smirked, misunderstanding completely, finally talking sense. The girl made her choice when she helped you people, but Joseph shook his head. You misunderstand me. This child saved my life when she had every reason to let me die. She knew the risk, knew how her people would react, and chose compassion over safety. He looked directly at Mercy, and she saw something in his eyes that made her chest tight with emotion. Such courage deserves better protection than coins can buy. Thomas stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with his father. Among our people, a life debt creates bonds stronger than blood. This girl is under our protection now. The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Sheriff Baines took a step back, his face pale. Hayes looked from Joseph to Thomas to the other. Native riders, all of whom had moved to form a protective circle around Mercy. You can't be serious, Hayes sputtered. She's one of us, not one of you. Is she? The scarred rider asked quietly. Because from where I stand, your people seem ready to harm her for showing kindness. Our people want to honor her for it. Mercy stared at them in shock. These men, whose families had suffered because of her father's actions, were claiming her as one of their own. It made no sense, and yet she could see in their faces that they meant every word. This is madness, Crawford said, his voice shaky. You can't just take our people. We're not taking anyone, Joseph replied calmly. We're offering sanctuary to someone who needs it. The choice is hers. All eyes turned to Mercy. She looked around, at the faces surrounding her, the townspeople who had ignored her for 2 years until she became inconvenient, and the native men who were willing to risk conflict to protect her. The choice should have been impossible, but somehow it felt like the easiest decision she had ever made. She started, then stopped. Her voice was barely a whisper. I don't understand why you would want to help me after what my father did. Joseph knelt down so he was at her eye level, just as Thomas had done earlier. Your father's actions were his own. Your actions are yours. Yesterday you proved that kindness can exist where hatred has failed. That is worth protecting. Hayes raised his rifle, his face twisted with anger. I won't let you take her. She's a white girl, and she belongs with white people. But before he could aim, something unexpected happened. Sheriff Baines stepped between Hayes and the native men, his own weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. Lower your rifle, Garrett, the sheriff said quietly. We're not starting a war over this. But Sheriff, I said, lower it. Sheriff Baines looked around at the tense faces surrounding them. The girl can make her own choice. If she wants to go with them, that's her right. Mercy looked at Joseph, then at Thomas, then at the other men who had pledged to protect her. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel alone. I want to go with them, she said, and her voice carried across the snow-covered valley like a promise. The silence that followed Mercy's decision stretched like a held breath. Hayes kept his rifle lowered, but his face burned with anger and frustration. The other townsmen shuffled their feet in the snow, uncertain what to do now that their target had chosen sides they couldn't understand. You're making a mistake, girl, Crawford said, his voice bitter. These people aren't your kind. When winter comes hard and food runs low, they won't care about your white skin or your Christian upbringing. But Thomas stepped forward, his voice steady and sure. She will never go hungry in our camp. She will never sleep cold or wake up alone. She will be taught skills to make her strong and given a place where her courage is valued. He looked directly at Crawford. Can your town promise her the same? The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Everyone knew Mercy had been forgotten by her own community, left to scrape and struggle while they looked the other way. Joseph mounted his horse and extended his hand down to Mercy. Are you ready? She looked back at her tiny cabin, at the place where she had been alone but free, poor but independent. Everything she owned could fit in a single bag, but somehow leaving felt like crossing an ocean rather than riding a few miles. What? About my things? She asked. Bring whatever matters to you, Joseph said kindly. Leave what doesn't. Mercy ran inside and gathered her few possessions. Her mother's shawl, a wooden doll her father had carved, the thin book of stories the school teacher had given her before leaving town. As she packed, she could hear voices outside, tense but controlled. The two groups were negotiating her departure like a treaty. When she emerged, Thomas was speaking quietly to Sheriff Baines. If anyone asks, tell them she chose to leave. Tell them no one forced her and no one took her against her will. And if they don't believe that, the sheriff asked, then tell them the truth, the scarred rider said firmly. Tell them she found people who valued her kindness more than they feared her bloodline. Hayes spat in the snow. This isn't over. You can't just ride off with one of our children. She was never yours, Joseph replied, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. You abandoned her the day her parents died. We are simply offering her what you never did, a family. Mercy climbed up behind Joseph on his horse, her small bag clutched tightly in her hands. From this height, she could see over the heads of all the men to the town beyond, smoke rising from chimneys where people were starting their day with no idea their world had just shifted. As they prepared to leave, Thomas rode close to Sheriff Baines. If anyone ever speaks ill of her choice, remind them of this day. Remind them that she saved a stranger's life and asked for nothing. In return, the horses turned toward the mountains, toward passes that led to places Mercy had never seen, and a life she couldn't yet imagine. But as they rode away from everything she had ever known, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years. She felt like she was going home. Months later, Mercy stood at the edge of the tribal camp. Watching the sun rise over mountains, she had learned to call home. Her hair was braided with leather cords in the style of the other girls her age, and her clothes were warm, well-made, and decorated with patterns that told stories of courage and belonging. She was no longer the thin, forgotten orphan who had lived on scraps and charity. Her cheeks had filled out from regular meals, her shoulders had straightened with confidence, and her eyes held a light that had been missing for years. "Little sister," Thomas called, using the name the tribe had given her. "Father wants to see you." Mercy turned and walked through the camp, past families who greeted her with genuine warmth, past elders who nodded their approval, past children who had accepted her as naturally as spring rain. She had learned their language, their customs, their ways of finding food and shelter in the wilderness. More importantly, she had learned what it felt like to be wanted. She found Joseph sitting by the central fire, carving a piece of wood with steady hands. His recovery from that night in the snow had been complete. But more than that, he seemed to have found new purpose in teaching Mercy the skills she would need to thrive. "Sit," he said, patting the ground beside him. "I have something to tell you." Mercy settled next to him, comfortable in his presence in a way she had never been comfortable with the adults in town. "What is it?" "A trader came through yesterday," Joseph said, still focused on his carving. "He brought news from your old town." Mercy felt her stomach tighten slightly, but not with the sharp fear she would have expected months ago. "What kind of news?" "Hayes and his men tried to make trouble after we left. They claimed we had kidnapped you, demanded the sheriff organize a rescue party. Joseph looked at her then, his eyes kind but serious. But Sheriff Baines told everyone the truth. He said you made your choice freely, and that choice should be respected. And did they respect it? Mercy asked. Joseph smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. The trader said most folks in town seemed relieved more than anything else. Seems they never quite knew what to do with an orphan girl anyway. Mercy nodded, unsurprised. She had always been an inconvenience to them, a reminder of obligations they didn't want to fulfill. But there's more, Joseph continued. The trader said some of the women in town have started asking questions about how a little girl ended up caring for herself for 2 years while grown adults looked the other way. Apparently, your choice to leave made them examine their own choices. Good, Mercy said firmly, and meant it. Maybe other children wouldn't have to face what she had faced. Joseph handed her the piece of wood he had been carving. It was a small horse, perfectly detailed, beautiful in its simplicity. This is for you, he said, to remember that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose kindness when the world expects cruelty. Mercy took the carving, holding it carefully in her palms. Thank you for everything. Thank you, Joseph replied, for showing an old man that some debts are worth paying forward. As the camp came alive around them with the sounds of family life, Mercy realized that saving Joseph from the snow had been the beginning of saving herself. She had found her people, her purpose, and her place in the world. She was no longer an orphan. She was little sister, daughter of the tribe, keeper of kindness in a hard world, and that was exactly who she was meant to be. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and compassion create miracles. That change lives forever. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.